Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel with a follow-up video on my Olivetti M300-02 that I showed you in the last video. Only this time you can see her casually booting into MS-DOS and launching Microsoft Windows 3.1. Using the original hard drive that came with the machine, so pretty excited to see that it was still working. So let's briefly enjoy this tiled background and the beautiful Windows 3.1 color schemes, and let's dive in to see how we fixed or partially fixed this Olivetti M300. So the first thing I did was look at this riser card and the battery that came with it. So as I explained in the previous video, this is a tap welded battery, so it's welded into place and soldered onto this riser card. So if you want to replace this battery, you will need to desolder it. And given the fact that this battery was almost dead, I did decide to do just that and replace it. Now I did have a coin cell holder lying around. It's a bit big for this CR coin cell here, but it will do the job. I had to bend this pin a little bit just to make it align with the holes on the PCB, but this should be just fine. So we can just solder the coin cell holder in, and this should give us a fresh new battery that we can easily replace in the future. Next up was to look at the main board and these capacitors here, which are in fact polymer capacitors, and they are pretty prone to leaking. And as you can see, the contacts on the capacitors aren't in the best of shape, so we will need to tackle those as well. Now the thing is that as soon as you start cleaning the board, and I'm using isopropyl alcohol here, they clean up pretty nicely, and that gives you the wrong impression sometimes, making you think that these capacitors are fine. But we will need to replace them, and to replace them I'm just going to practice a little bit on this TV tuner board that I'm no longer using. And the way that you remove these caps is you just take a set of pliers, you hold them onto the cap, and then you just twist it around, and then it should just fall off. The legs will still be included on the pads here, so we can use the soldering iron to pick them up, move them away from the pad here, and then usually they will stick to your soldering iron. And we can just add some flux here because I want to remove the excess solder. And then you can kind of visually inspect these capacitors. In this case, these are fine, they haven't leaked, but I'll show you in a bit how the capacitors look like on the main board. So we're going to be using the same technique here. So we take our pliers, we turn the cap, it snaps off, and what's left here on the pads are the legs that were on the capacitor, so we just need to kind of remove those. They usually stick on your soldering iron, so you can get rid of them like that. And what you might also notice is this kind of fishy smell while you are heating up the pad, and that's actually the smell of the electrolyte which is burning up, and it's a really horrible stench actually, and that further confirms the fact that, you know, these caps were definitely bad. So here I'm just going to use my desoldering wick to get rid of the excess solder, but yeah, this works pretty well for me. As you can see, the pads clean up nicely in terms of solder, but then you can finish it off with some isopropyl alcohol, because there are going to be some like dark bits on the solder pad, and with isopropyl alcohol you can clean it up pretty nicely. And what you're left with are two clean pads that you can use to put a new component on. So another cap, again we twist it, it snaps off. And here you can see at the bottom of the kind of plastic housing, you can see the kind of green gooey, and this is actually the electrolyte that has leaked out of the capacitor. And it sometimes has a way of sticking to that pad, making it virtually impossible to heat up the pad with your soldering iron, which is the case here. So I'm just going to be adding some additional flux here just to make sure that the soldering iron can get a better grip, and then just pick up the leg which was on the pad. and then use some desoldering wick to clean up the rest of the pads. So you can see the wick picking up the excess solder which was on the pad. The black markings you see here are still some residue of the electrolyte that was spilled off of the capacitor, but again with some isopropyl alcohol usually it cleans up well. I was actually a bit lazy here. I should have scrubbed it a little bit longer, but as you can see it already looks a lot better than what it did before. Another thing that you might encounter if you remove one of those caps is that the pad would have been damaged by the electrolyte to a certain degree that it might come off of the PCB completely, as was the case for example here. As I was cleaning it, the pad just lifted itself up from the PCB. Now it was still connected to the trace, but this is obviously a situation that you wanna avoid. That's why it's best to replace those types of capacitors as soon as possible. Unfortunately in this case it was a little bit too late, so there was still continuity between the pad and the testing point to the left, so we're going to be using that to kind of bridge that connection. And then here we also had two more capacitors that we want to remove next to the keyboard controller, and again you can see lots of electrolyte here on the plastic housing and also on the PCB itself. And this gunk can actually ruin traces on the motherboard. It wasn't really the case here, as I was able to clean it up pretty nicely. First thing I did here was remove the legs from the solder pads, then clean it up a little bit with the desoldering wick, and then with some isopropyl alcohol clean up the rest. And as you can see, there are no traces damaged here, fortunately. But these caps definitely needed replacement. And as you can see here on that bottom side of the plastic housing, lots of the electrolyte is still visible. So it's a good thing that we decided to replace those. And speaking of replacements, unfortunately I didn't have any SMD capacitors with the same capacitance and voltage ratings, so I had to go with these through-hole electrolytics, and I actually bended the legs a little bit so that they would fit the two pads which were foreseen for the SMD components. So I'm just going to be adding some solder here to the legs and to the pads, and then gently position the capacitor here, taking into account the polarity, and just attaching them on the main board. And I also noticed that in previous revisions of this motherboard, through-hole electrolytic capacitors were used. So time to fire her up and see if that made a difference. And it absolutely did nothing. So we get the same behavior, black screen, and on occasion it would boot up and go into this kind of infinite reset cycle. So time to take a look at the power supply. And before we can do that, we need to remove this kind of power button mechanism from the power supply very gently, because this is just a horror story waiting to happen in terms of plastic bits falling off. So I'm just going to be disconnecting the floppy drive, the motherboard connector, and lift up the power supply here so that I can have better access to the hard drive power connector. Remove that as well, and then we can take a look at the actual power supply. So we have the fan here, we have the power connectors, we have some kind of shielding here on the sides, and it's always a bit of an adventure to find out how to open these things, because I didn't see any visible screws here. Even after removing these sides here, there were no screws on the power supply. The only thing that I did notice that on the back there were all kinds of clips here, these metal clips. So I assumed that it somehow needs to slide open like this, but it was kind of stuck. And then I noticed these two clips here were bent out of shape. So using a set of pliers, I just straightened them out, and then I could kind of pull off the cover of the power supply, making sure I don't break the cables here. So I'm going to be removing those out of the way, and then the power supply should just slide on open. And it actually looked pretty clean. Didn't really notice anything visually. The caps looked fine. I did pull out my ESR meter and I did some measurements, and I did found a cap here which gave us a little warning with a very high ESR value, which is not good. So I decided to remove that capacitor. It's a 10 microfarad capacitor. And you know, while visually inspecting a capacitor, I didn't see anything wrong with it. There was no bulging and I didn't see any leakages coming off of the capacitor. But what I did notice that while I was desoldering it, I had this horrible fishy smell, and while looking at the bottom part of the capacitor, you can definitely see that electrolyte started to leak out of this. And even out of circuit, I got the same bad ESR reading. So this one definitely needed replacement. So I found another 10 microfarad capacitor, and these ESR values, in order to interpret them, it's always nice to look at a table like this. That kind of gives you an expected ESR reading for a certain capacitance at a certain voltage. So in this case, the 10 microfarad capacitor at 50 volts should result in an ESR reading of about 1.6 ohms, and that's exactly what we are seeing on our ESR meter. The fact that the actual capacitance is a bit off falls into the fault tolerance of this capacitor. So let's put it into the PCB, solder the legs, clip them off, and see if this made a difference. And again, it did not. So nothing on the screen, so let's investigate further. So we've already replaced one capacitor, this one here, so let's look at a second one. Now the ESR reading shows us 2.3 ohms, which is a bit much, but again, as this is an in-circuit reading, it's always best to pull it out of the circuit and do a separate reading. And here we have 6 bigger capacitors also on the output side. Let's give those a quick reading as well. So the ESR value is good. We cannot read the capacitance. That's probably because the capacitor is in circuit. So let's go ahead and remove it. And here we have it. Again, upon a visual inspection, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with it. There's no leakage here. The capacitor looks very clean, but I did remove all of them and checked all of them out of circuit, and I couldn't find anything wrong with them. The capacitance readings was spot on, and all of them had very low ESR values, which is to be expected from a 2200 microfarad capacitor. Now, because I didn't have any replacements for these output capacitors here, and I also suspect that the main input capacitor here is working fine, I did go ahead and replace all of the little capacitors here on the output side. And with these new capacitors in, once I turned on the power supply, the computer immediately started. It did go into that reset cycle again, but after a while I noticed that it was able to complete the boot cycle and pass all of the checks that are done at startup. So here it's asking me to turn the key to the unlock position, and that is in fact that slider which is on the power supplies. So we not only have a power button, but we also have a separate button which will enable the keyboard. So I need to push this in order to get the keyboard to work and get the computer to boot. And after the boot, it will enter the CMOS setup utility. And here we can configure the time, the date, specify the fact that we have a hard drive, the floppy drive, the video mode. Notice that there's also this blinking battery icon. That just means that the machine has started for the first time and it hasn't done the setup yet. But after setting everything up, we will do a reboot now, and notice that it starts in the proper 80 column mode now. It passes all of the checks. It is able to find our fixed disk. It seems to find 2 floppy disks here, which is a bit odd. So it gives us an error, but it does boot from the hard drive now and it boots into MS-DOS. But what happens here is that the computer starts resetting itself while it is booting into DOS, so that is still an issue. And what I also noticed is that when the computer has been running for a couple of minutes, it is always passing all of the checks that the computer does at startup. It is able to boot into MS-DOS without any issues, so we no longer have that reset issue in MS-DOS. It launches Microsoft Windows without an issue, and the computer is running very stable. So the weird thing about this is that the computer needs to be running for a couple of minutes before we get to this stage here. Other than that, the computer will do its kind of reset cycle, and then after a couple of minutes it seems to be running fine. Now unfortunately I don't have any new capacitors to replace the output capacitors in the power supply, so for now I'm going to be leaving it at that. I have ordered some new capacitors, so I will be replacing all of them with brand new ones. And I'm kind of hoping that that will fix the cold boot issue where the computer still keeps on resetting itself. But like I said, once the computer has been running for a couple of minutes, it's running absolutely fine. I can restart it how many times I want. It will run flawlessly. But we obviously still have the issue with the cold start. And what I've also noticed is that after replacing all of the capacitors, every time I turn on the machine right now, I do get an output on the screen, which was not the case before. So as you might remember before, sometimes when turning on the PC, the screen went blank and stayed blank. This is no longer the case. So yeah, so we're making progress. It's still not 100%, but it's really nice to see the PC running again, seeing Windows booting off of this PC. I'm looking forward to installing the brand new caps, and I have some other plans to further investigate the issue. I'm also happy that it is far more predictable now. I mean, every time we do a cold start, we get something on the screen. We do get the reboot cycle as you're seeing here, but after a while it does continue with all of the checks at post. It retains all the settings, so the battery is good. It detects the hard drive, the floppy disk drive, everything is fine. The initial boot into MS-DOS also causes a reset, and it does that a couple of times. But again, after a while, it does complete the boot cycle and the machine seems to be running very stable. Now this does seem to indicate some kind of capacitor issue, so yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting the new capacitors so that I can try them out. Because the machine is definitely capable of booting into MS-DOS without any issues, completing the entire boot cycle and launching Microsoft Windows. Other things I still want to try is an alternative power supply, which is going to be difficult because it has a non-standard connector. I also want to check the memory just to make sure that there aren't any issues with that. And again, this might be more difficult than it sounds because the 2 megabytes of memory which is soldered on the board here uses a non-standard format, so I cannot just desolder it and solder something else in it. I would need to take a look at the actual memory chips themselves. I've already attached an oscilloscope to the thing and I didn't see any voltage drops or weird behaviors when the computer starts resetting, so that was also a bit of a bummer. But other than that, I have really no idea what else to check on this machine. So if you guys have any more suggestions, please put them in the comments below. And hopefully by part 3 of this series, the machine will be completely up and running and I will be able to show you a cold boot of the machine without any issues. So if you're into retro computing and you like this type of content, please consider looking at some of the other videos on this channel. Consider subscribing, giving this a like or a comment below. I would really appreciate it. And I hope to see you guys soon in part 3, where hopefully the machine will be completely up and running again. Stay safe, take care, and see you guys soon. Bye-bye.